December 1942. A cold wind swept across the Algerian desert as dawn began to lift the horizon. Dust curled around the wheels of a small olive-drab machine that hummed quietly against the sand. 3 American soldiers sat inside, helmets tilted low, rifles across their laps, eyes fixed ahead. There was no armor, no steel plating, not even a windshield upright to hide behind. Just a short wheelbase, a flat hood, and a courage that came from the belief that this simple machine would not fail them. The Jeep bounced across the rough terrain, cutting through wadis and ridges where larger trucks bogged down. It carried food, maps, and hope in equal measure. Behind them, columns of Shermans and half-tracks strained to keep pace. The Jeep seemed almost alive, slipping through the gaps, scouting ahead, bringing messages where no radio could reach. To the Germans watching from the ridge lines, it looked absurd, a toy in a war of steel giants. But by the end of the war, this unarmored, unassuming vehicle would become the single most trusted machine in the Allied arsenal. And its story began long before that dawn in North Africa. In the late 1930s, as the world edged toward war, armies everywhere were trapped by the same problem: mobility. The First World War had proven that steel and men alone could not win ground fast enough. Modern warfare demanded movement, fast, flexible, relentless. Yet, the United States Army still relied on horses, motorcycles, and scattered civilian trucks to move its troops. What it needed was something new, small, light, and able to cross any terrain. By 1940, as Europe fell under the weight of blitzkrieg, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps issued a desperate call: a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle that could carry soldiers, tow small guns, and survive the mud and chaos of modern war. It had to weigh under 1,300 pounds, run on a 4-cylinder engine, and be delivered within an impossible deadline: 49 days. Few believed it could be done. Yet in a small Pennsylvania workshop, the American Bantam Car Company began sketching what would become the first prototype. Working day and night, engineers shaped steel and welded frames by hand. They finished just in time. The Bantam reconnaissance car rolled onto the test field at Camp Holabird in September 1940. It was crude, but alive. The Army was impressed, but skeptical of Bantam's small production capacity. So the designs were passed, controversially, to Willys Overland and Ford, 2 automotive giants capable of mass manufacture. What followed was a race of innovation. Willys introduced a more powerful engine, while Ford focused on standardized production techniques. Both versions were refined, tested, and merged into a single, standardized vehicle, the Willys MB, later joined by Ford's near-identical GPW. By early 1941, the Jeep, a nickname born from the abbreviation GP for General Purpose, was ready for the field. It was light, reliable, and astonishingly versatile. Generals could command from it. Medics could evacuate the wounded with it. Engineers could tow artillery behind it. As the U.S. prepared for the war now consuming the globe, few machines would embody American practicality and ingenuity as completely as this squat, open-topped vehicle. The first shipments were already on their way, toward a desert battlefield where the Jeep would prove its worth against an empire. By late 1942, the first production Jeeps were arriving in North Africa, their olive paint still fresh, their odometers barely turned. Crated and shipped from East Coast factories, they were quickly assembled at forward depots and rolled straight into war. Each one was identical in function, yet unique in the dust, dents, and memories it gathered. In the North African campaign, the Jeep's design proved nothing short of revolutionary. Where heavy British trucks struggled across dunes, the Jeep bounded effortlessly. Its 60-horsepower Willys Go Devil engine could climb gradients of 45 degrees and ford rivers 2 feet deep. With 4-wheel drive engaged, It could move through terrain that even tracked vehicles hesitated to cross. American and British troops quickly adopted it for every imaginable role: reconnaissance, courier work, radio operations, and medical evacuation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later remarked that the Jeep, alongside the C-47 transport and the landing craft, was one of the three tools that won the war. In letters home, soldiers called it the faithful mule, the little warrior, and the best friend a man could have. Mechanics stripped it down in minutes, field-repaired broken axles, and reassembled it with nothing more than basic tools and a hammer. It was simplicity turned into strategy. As production expanded, Willys and Ford built over 500,000 Jeeps. Standardization meant that every part, from spark plug to steering column, could fit any other Jeep in the world. It was industrial efficiency at its purest form, assembly line warfare. The Jeep soon appeared everywhere the Allies fought. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, it pulled wounded men through mud tracks once thought impassable. In Sicily and Italy, it hauled ammunition under artillery fire. Across Normandy, it scouted enemy lines and ferried officers through the hedgerows of France. Axis troops, especially the Germans, were both amused and unsettled by it. They saw American commanders riding openly through battle zones, unarmored and confident, something no Wehrmacht officer would dare. To them, it reflected a strange, almost reckless belief in mobility and speed over protection. But that belief worked. The unarmored Jeep became not a weakness, but a symbol of how America's engineers built for function, not fear. And it was this simple strength that would soon face the test of its life, on battlefields far beyond the desert. Tactically, the Jeep changed how armies thought about movement. Before it, mobility meant trucks or tanks, slow, heavy, and limited to roads. The Jeep shattered that rule. It was small enough to slip between trees, powerful enough to climb ridges, and light enough for soldiers to lift out of ditches. Commanders could now lead from the front, scouts could move deep into enemy territory, and medics could reach the wounded under fire. Its mechanical genius lay in its simplicity. The Willys Go Devil engine, a 2.2-liter four-cylinder, produced only modest power on paper, but combined with low gearing and four-wheel drive, it delivered unstoppable traction. The flat, low frame kept it stable on slopes, while its short wheelbase allowed turns impossible for larger vehicles. Every bolt and fitting was standardized, every component designed to be replaced in minutes. In the field, this meant something revolutionary. A soldier could break down his Jeep, fix it, and be back on the road before dawn. Maintenance became survival, and simplicity became a weapon. But the Jeep's greatest impact went beyond metal and mechanics. It changed the spirit of the men who drove it. For the soldiers who lived with it, the Jeep became more than a machine. It was a companion. It carried letters from home, hauled the wounded to safety, and brought laughter in the rare quiet hours between battles. Men named them, painted their hoods with pin-up art, and treated them like loyal friends. When engines coughed to life at dawn, every soldier nearby knew the sound. A rough, steady growl that meant movement, progress, survival. German and Japanese prisoners often expressed disbelief at how casually Americans used the Jeep. Officers drove unarmored through shellfire. Engineers improvised with mounted .30 caliber Brownings, and medics turned the rear seats into stretchers. The sight of soldiers eating rations beside their Jeeps, radios humming, tires splattered with mud, was a picture of relaxed confidence that the Axis could not understand. In American hands, the Jeep symbolized freedom, not just to move, but to adapt. It embodied the American way of war, flexible, inventive, and unafraid to improvise. Every dusty mile it covered reminded both friend and foe that America's greatest strength wasn't only in its weapons, it was in its ingenuity. And soon, that ingenuity would face its defining test on the battlefield. By early 1943, the Jeep had already proven itself in North Africa. But it was during the Allied invasion of Sicily that its legend truly began. The campaign demanded mobility under chaos: steep mountains, shattered roads, and shifting battle lines. Where armored columns hesitated, Jeeps moved like water, flowing through every gap, linking every unit. Commanders used them to scout ahead and coordinate fire support. Radio operators strung antenna wires from their rear bumpers. Medics strapped wounded men to hoods and sped through artillery fire to field stations. At dawn on July 10, 1943, waves of American troops landed near Gela and Licata. Within hours, Jeeps were rolling off landing craft, splashing through shallow surf, engines coughing under saltwater spray. They raced up the beaches alongside infantrymen, often under machine gun fire. In some sectors, they became mobile command posts. Generals standing in open air, binoculars raised, wind whipping at their maps. To the Germans, it looked reckless. To the Americans, it was leadership in motion. The Jeep allowed the U.S. Army to operate with a speed the Axis couldn't match. A single vehicle could ferry officers, supplies, and ammunition through terrain that immobilized trucks and horses alike. In Tunisia, Patton's Second Corps used Jeeps to close the Kasserine Gap, relaying orders faster than enemy lines could react. In Italy, they climbed the muddy slopes of Monte Cassino, engines groaning but never failing. What made this unarmored machine so deadly wasn't its firepower. It was the communication it carried. Every Jeep became a lifeline. Between platoons, between fronts, between chaos and coordination. Messages once delayed by hours now reached in minutes. Radios mounted on their rear seats turned open ground into a web of instant control. The enemy soon learned to fear that sound, though rattle of a flat-4 engine echoing in the distance, because it meant American reinforcements were already on their way. And yet, the greatest test for this little machine still lay ahead, on the beaches of Normandy and the jungles of the Pacific, where survival depended on how far a Jeep could go before it broke. June 6, 1944. Normandy. The sea was gray, the air thick with smoke and fear. Waves of landing craft crashed against the French coast, their ramps slamming down under the fire of German machine guns. Among the soldiers and tanks came something unexpected: the small, squat Jeeps, waterproofed with grease and sealed for the surf. They rolled off the ramps and splashed through the tide like iron dolphins, engines sputtering, tires churning against sand and shrapnel. Once ashore, they became the arteries of the invasion. Jeeps carried stretchers from the beaches, ammunition to the bluffs, and orders between command posts hidden in hedgerows. They were first in and last out, weaving through wreckage and smoke. Engineers drove them under sniper fire to repair cables. Chaplains used them as mobile altars. Correspondents crouched in the back seats to record history in motion. In the confusion of D-Day, the Jeep was one of the few constants, a familiar hum amid chaos. In the months that followed, as the Allies pushed inland, the Jeep's flexibility became irreplaceable. Across the bocage country of Normandy, where every field was a fortress, Jeeps moved through narrow lanes impossible for tanks. When Patton's Third Army broke out in August, his convoys of Jeeps raced ahead of supply lines, coordinating an advance so rapid the Germans could hardly comprehend it. Thousands of miles away in the Pacific, Jeeps adapted again, their tires cutting through coral sand and jungle mud. On Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Okinawa, they served as ambulances, command vehicles, and gun platforms. Marines strapped flamethrowers to the rear, fitted machine guns to the front, and even floated modified Jeeps across lagoons on makeshift pontoons. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to seeing heavy trucks stuck in the mud, were stunned by how fast the Americans could move supplies and wounded under fire. The Jeep became a symbol of relentless motion, the war machine that never stopped, even when the road ended. From Europe's hedgerows to the Pacific's jungles, it had earned its reputation not through armor or weaponry, but through something far rarer in war: trust. Soldiers believed in it completely, and when the smoke cleared, the trust would define the Jeep's place in history. By 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and the Pacific Islands fell one by one, the Jeep had become a legend in motion. Over 640,000 had been built, more than any other light vehicle of the war. From Eisenhower's headquarters to the muddy trails of Burma, the same unmistakable shape appeared: flat hood, 7-slot grille, and a canvas top fluttering in the wind. Military. Reports praised its reliability with near reverence. U.S. Army Ordnance Studies recorded that the Jeep could run over 1,500 miles with minimal maintenance, a figure unheard of in wartime conditions. Mechanics loved it because it never hid its problems. Everything was accessible, visible, and fixable. Soldiers swore by it because it did everything asked of it. No questions, no excuses. German and Japanese troops, who had mocked it early in the war, came to respect it deeply. Captured Jeeps were repainted with Axis markings and pressed into service. Their enemies valued them as much as their creators did. After the fall of Berlin, photos showed American and Soviet troops riding together, both smiling from the same kind of seat. The Jeep's unarmored body had survived a world of steel and fire. It carried generals and privates alike, moved under artillery, through storms and across continents. It was never meant to be glorious, but it became indispensable. As the guns fell silent in 1945, Jeeps rolled through liberated towns, their engines echoing through the rubble. Children waved from doorways. Soldiers threw candy from the back seats. The little machine that began as an experiment had become the living pulse of victory. But the war's end did not mean the Jeep's story was finished. In many ways, it was just beginning. When peace finally came, the Jeep transitioned from battlefield to home front almost overnight. Thousands of surplus Jeeps, once covered in dust and bullet scars, were sold to civilians for a few $100s apiece. Farmers used them to plow fields. Explorers took them into mountains, and young veterans drove them simply because they reminded them of the war they had survived. In Europe and Asia, Allied reconstruction teams relied on them just as the armies had. Jeeps carried doctors into ruined villages, engineers to bridge sites, and diplomats through the ruins of cities once fought over. Nations that had never seen an American vehicle before adopted it as a tool of rebuilding. From France to the Philippines, its silhouette became a symbol not of conquest, but of restoration. Manufacturers saw its potential immediately. Willys converted its wartime design into the CJ series. Civilian Jeep, promoting it as the farm and field vehicle that helped win the war. Its popularity exploded. What began as a military necessity became an American icon, a bridge between soldier and citizen, discipline and freedom, even in later conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East. The spirit of the Jeep endured. Modern 4x4s, from Humvees to civilian SUVs, all trace their lineage to that simple, flat-hooded machine born of urgency in 1940. Generals would later say that while tanks and planes won battles, it was the Jeep that connected them all, that kept the war moving when the world threatened to stop. Its journey from factory floor to final victory had redefined the very idea of trust in machinery. And that legacy, humble, enduring, unstoppable, would outlive the men who first drove it across the sands of Africa. In the vast machinery of World War II, a war defined by bombers, battleships, and tanks, the Jeep stood apart. It was never the largest, the fastest, or the most powerful. Yet, in its simplicity, It captured something no weapon ever could: the bond between man and machine built on absolute trust. For soldiers far from home, the Jeep was more than transport. It was a companion. It carried them through mud, shellfire, and snow. It ferried the wounded, hauled ammunition, and bore messages across no man's land. It was often the first vehicle into liberated towns and the last to leave a collapsing front. Wherever the American flag advanced, a Jeep led the way. Its legacy was not written in steel thickness or gun caliber, but in endurance, the quiet kind that wins wars without fanfare. Every bolt, every turn of its wheels spoke of industrial genius meeting human need at exactly the right moment in history. Decades later, veterans would still speak of it with warmth, of the nights they slept under its canvas, of how it always started when everything else froze. To them, the Jeep symbolized not just victory, but resilience, adaptability, and freedom, the very traits that defined America's fight in World War II. Today, restored Jeeps still roll in parades, their engines crackling like echoes from another century. Children climb onto them, unaware that these humble machines once carried the weight of an entire generation's courage. And so, the Jeep remains, unarmored, unpretentious, unstoppable. A reminder that sometimes the most trusted machine in a world at war is not the one built to destroy, but the one built to endure.